Hello everyone, this is one of a series of short interviews that I've been conducting at the Bay Area Alignment Workshop, which is run by FAR.AI. Links to what we're discussing, as usual, are in the description. A transcript is, as usual, available at axrp.net, and as usual, if you want to support the podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/axrpodcast. Well, let's continue to the interview. All right, well, today I'm speaking with Erik Jenner. Erik, can you say a few words about yourself?
I'm currently a third-year PhD student at UC Berkeley at the Center for Human Compatible AI, and working on various things around model internals there.
Cool. And right now we're at this alignment workshop being run by FAR.AI. How are you finding it?
It's been fun so far. I mean, we've only had a few talks, but I thought all of them were interesting.
Cool. Well, so speaking of work that you've done, I guess we're going to talk about this chess paper that you worked on. So that listeners can look it up. What's the name of this paper?
It's called Evidence of Learned Look-Ahead in a Chess-Playing Neural Network.
Okay. And what's the...
So...
That sort of tells you what it is, but can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, so I guess the question we're asking ourselves is, neural networks are pretty good at playing chess now, and playing chess in the sense not just of like having Monte Carlo tree search with a big explicit search tree, but also playing chess if you only give them one forward pass to make every single move.
Okay.
And so the question is, how are they so good at playing chess? And in particular, any humans or like manual programs we write that are similarly good at chess, they like internally have to do a lot of search and think about future moves rather than just relying on intuitions or heuristics. And so the question is, are neural networks just like really good at heuristically deciding what move to make, or are they doing something kind of similar where they're looking ahead in some way when deciding what move to make next?
Sure. And so when you're looking ahead in some way, I think like the kind of like we have this vague notion of like planning ahead or search, but like, you know, kind of the devil's in the details of like how you actually operationalize it. So how do you operationalize it in the paper?
Yeah, so I think what we ideally we would have wanted to find some like clear search tree in there and stuff like that, but realistically we had to sort of settle for something much broader, which is just the model is representing which moves it's likely going to make a little bit into the future, and uses that to decide which move to make right now.
When it's representing which moves it is likely to make in the future, do you know if that's like... So one version of that is, I guess the sort of thing I'm likely to do in the future is this, therefore the current... What would be a reasonable thing to do right now to prepare for this future in which I'm going to do this random thing, versus like thinking carefully about, okay, well, in the future it would be good to do this, therefore now it would be good to do this. Yeah,
so I mean, what we look at is like specific moves that the model is going to make in the future.
Okay.
So it's not just like some generic type of thing that it might do, it's like specific moves. Okay. What we don't know is sort of exactly what the like algorithm here is like. For example, you could imagine that the model is like, it would be nice if I could play this checkmate move in the future, so now I have to do this to prepare for that. Or it could be that the model is considering different moves it could make right now, and then for each one it's thinking about what would be good follow-ups and use that to evaluate them. And we aren't really distinguishing between these two different options. We're just saying there's some sense of thinking about future moves, and that's important.
Okay, so it's representing future moves, and you also said that there's some way of like taking information about future moves into the present. Was that right?
Yeah. So specifically, some of the experiments we do are just probing, where we just provide correlational evidence that there is some representation that we can use to extract these future moves. But then we also have some experiments where we do certain interventions that we argue, I think, correspond to intervening on future moves and show that we can, for example, destroy model performance in very specific ways.
So are the interventions something like if you make the model think that it won't be able to do this checkmate move later, then it like doesn't prepare for it right now?
Yeah, basically. We are blocking, in some of the experiments, for example, we're blocking information flow in very specific ways that we think corresponds to like the ability to think about this future checkmate. And then we show that this has like a much bigger effect on the model's performance than if we do like random other ablations in other parts of the model.
I wonder... So my understanding is that your dataset is a particular subset of chess puzzles, right?
Yeah, so we start with this public dataset of puzzles that are assigned to be solved by human players, and then we do a lot of different filtering to sort of make it suitable for our purposes. So for example, we want puzzles where the response by the opponent is sort of pretty obvious, or that there's one clear response, such that then there's also only one follow-up move that we have to look for in the model. So if you could imagine cases where you play a move, the opponent has two different good responses, and then how you respond to that depends on which one they picked. And that would make all of our experiments much harder or more annoying because we don't know which move to look for anymore. Whereas in our case, we filter for cases where there's actually one ground truth, like future move that we can look for.
Yeah, so maybe you're filtering this out, but it seems like one interesting thing to look for would be a world where there are sort of, like imagine some chess puzzle where there are two ways that I can get checkmate, right? I can achieve checkmate, right? I can like move my knight, then something happens, then I checkmate with my knight, or I move my rook, something happens, then I checkmate with my rook, right? And like one thing that would be kind of interesting is if a model like chose the knight path, but if you intervened on it, and if you said, in the future you're not going to move your knight to get checkmate, if it then like went the rook route of the checkmate, that would be kind of interesting. Like it would show some sort of like forward planning that's not that's like responsive to predictions of the future move in like an interesting sort of structured way. Do you have any evidence like that? Or
there's not much on this in the paper, but we did try a few things kind of like this. So for example, one thing we tested is basically we have two possible moves, like you say, and then I think it's a little bit simpler in that in the end sort of everything ends up being very similar, but you have two initial moves to sort of kick off this checkmate sequence. And then what we tested is looking at the evaluation of the network. So if we intervene on one of those moves, then the evaluation stays high, like the network still thinks it's winning. But if we intervene on both, then we sort of get the super additive effect where now it realizes, it thinks that it's no longer winning, there's no checkmate anymore. So it seems like there's some kind of logical or like maximum structure in that evaluation where it realizes that either one of those would be sufficient to win.
Okay, and is that like in the appendices of the paper? Or is
no, that's like not even in the appendices. That's sort of like a thing we tried once. And then, the main problem with this is we weren't entirely sure how to sort of rigorously test this across many many puzzles. Like this was in a few puzzles that we set up, but it's probably possible, but it's non-trivial to sort of automatically find a lot of puzzles with this property.
Right.
And so we just didn't get around to actually turning that into like a real experiment, and it's more like a thing we briefly tried.
I wonder if there's some tag. So you get puzzles from this like online set of chess puzzles. I wonder if they have some sort of tag for like two-way paths.
Yeah, maybe. They definitely have lots of tags, but I think it's sort of more for geometric motifs. Like I guess it's sort of for motifs the way humans think about them, and maybe there happens to be one like that, but I don't think so.
Fair enough. So I guess I'm interested a little bit in the details. So in order to see that the neural net has this representation of the future move, you train this probe. Like, I don't know, a generic worry about training probes is it might just be correlational, or it might even just be that like, you're training a probe on very high dimensional data. Maybe you can probe for anything. Like, how solid do you think this probing result is?
Yeah, I think if we only had the probing result, I would say it's very suggestive that there's something interesting, but it's very unclear how to interpret it. I mean, the way we try to get around this is by also, like, we have a very simple baseline. That's just training the same probe on a randomly initialized model. Yeah. So at least we're making sure that, like, not the probe isn't doing all the work. Yeah. And we can also see that probing accuracy goes up through the layers of the network. So in later layers, it's sort of better predicting future moves, which is kind of encouraging. But I think if we only had the probe, I would be pretty worried about any, like, actual mechanistic claims about what's going on in the model. And then, so that we also have sort of these other experiments that I think are, that their weakness is that they're less obviously about look ahead. Like the probe is very obviously just probing for these future moves. The other experiments require some interpretation for claiming they're about look ahead, but they're interventional and so in that sense more robust.
And the interventional experiments, are those like, am I right that you're intervening on features that you found using the probe?
No, they're basically separate. So, for those interventional experiments, maybe I should say a little bit about the architecture of this network. So it's a transformer where every, like what would be a token position in a language model is sort of a square of the chessboard in this transformer instead. So it gets like a chessboard position as an input, and then it does a forward pass, and every square corresponds to like a slice of the activations. Okay. And so we can talk about things like the representations that are stored on some specific square. And one thing we found pretty consistently is that the network does seem to store information about moves, for example, on squares that are involved in that move, or like kind of in places where you'd expect.
Okay.
And so a lot of the other interventional experiments are more about looking at the information stored on moves, on squares that are involved in future moves, or the information flow from those squares to other squares and vice versa, and things like that.
Right.
So I think the structure for a lot of those arguments is basically saying, we see these really strong effects where some types of ablations have a much bigger effect than other types of ablations. And really the only explanation we can come up with is that there's some kind of looking at future moves going on, because otherwise these effects just seem pretty inexplicable to us.
Right.
But it's a little bit trickier to like be sure that there's not some alternative explanation for those results.
I mean, would it work to... So the version of this experiment that was in my head was like, you know, you find a probe, you find some like activations in the network that represent future moves, and then you sort of like ablate the thing where it realizes that it's going to make this future move as found by this probe.
Yeah.
I'm wondering like would that experiment work functionally?
Yeah, so you can sort of just subtract that probe direction, and it often messes up performance, but you can also like do random other stuff to the activations, and it has similarly big effects on performance. Okay. So yeah, it would be nice if there was some experiment you could do where you're sort of not just making the model ignore its best move, but like take some other move by adding in certain vectors that you got from your probe. We don't have any results like that.
So for the actual ablation thing you did, is it a thing where you're ablating the information on that square, and like ablating the information on a random square would not be that bad, but on the square that corresponds to the future move, that really...
Yeah, so for example, we have this activation patching experiment, or activation patching just meaning we take activations from some corrupted forward pass and patch them into a clean forward pass. And that sort of tells us how important is information stored on various squares for the output. And then we see that there are some types of squares where we can predict just from the architecture that they're going to be important. But then sort of the main effect we see where squares are important apart from that is on the target square of this future move, like the one that the model is going to make after the one that's making the current position, basically. And so for example, the average effect of patching on that square is bigger than the average effect of patching on the square that has the maximum effect in any given position. So if we sort of, in every position, we take the max of all the other effects on other squares, that's still smaller than patching on this one particular square. And so I think it's pretty unlikely that this is just because those squares happen to be like heuristically important. It seems like it's probably the fact that it is this target square of the future move that makes it important.
Okay. So I guess another question I have is, if someone's reading this paper, like, they're going to observe like, oh yeah, you know, messing up this square degrades performance more than messing up this square. And there's this question of, okay, how big of, and for a lot of these experiments, right, how big does the effect need to be for it to, for your explanation to be, you know, the like, to be vindicated, basically. Yeah. How do you think readers should think about that?
I think that's a good question. I think overall, I would say our effect sizes tend to be pretty big, like in the case where we get effects at all, but not very consistently. So it's something like, even after the filtering we do to our puzzle data set, there are still some puzzles where we just don't see any effect at all, basically. Okay. And my guess, like, we manually looked at some of those, and in many cases, I think it's kind of reasonable that we don't get an effect, or like, sort of for each of those, we can kind of explain it away, but, you know, that's, maybe that shouldn't convince readers. So I think that's one of the big reasons to maybe be skeptical of them. But then I think sort of the average effect sizes, or the effect sizes in the positions where there's anything at all, I think they're often pretty big. Like, for example, for example, if the probability that the model assigned to the top move without any intervention was like 50% or 60%, it often goes down to something like 10% or sometimes even much less than that from sort of very small interventions, where if you do an equivalently big intervention, but in some random place in the model, you just see no effect at all, basically.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's interesting, like, so one metric you could be tracking is just like accuracy loss, but I guess there's this other metric you could track, which is like accuracy loss per amount of activation you degraded, and saying like, oh yeah, these are the really efficient activations to degrade is also like kind of relevant.
So personally, like one of the interventions we have, which is, we found this one attention head in the model that we think one of the main things it's doing, or the main thing, is sort of moving information from this target square of a future move to the target square of the immediate move the model is going to make next. So that seems very suggestive of some look-ahead stuff going on. And one of the ways we validate that this is like the main thing the head is doing is by sort of ablating only this information flow between those two squares, which corresponds to sort of zeroing out a single number in this attention map of that head. And that has a very big effect, whereas if we zero out all the other numbers in that attention head, or if we zero out like some random other attention head completely, it has a very small effect. So there's sort of this one activation, like one floating point number we can zero out, which has much bigger effects than most other interventions we can do.
Gotcha. So this is the AI X-Risk Research Podcast. I'm wondering, like, do you see this work as, like, do you see it just as an academic curiosity, or do you think that it's relevant to understanding X-Risk from AI?
Yeah, so it was definitely partially motivated by X-Risk initially. I think, like, in hindsight, the impact on like reducing X-Risk is probably not that amazing. But some of the connections that I was sort of interested in initially are. I guess the main thing is, people in the X-Risk space have been talking a lot about models being scary if they can do internal search or planning and things like that.
Right.
And so, for example, it might be nice if we had general methods that could tell us whether a certain model was doing internal planning. It would also be nice if we could then localize that to some extent, and maybe that's an especially important target for interpretability or for interventions on what the model does. So I think there's sort of both in a perspective of understanding whether models are capable of this, and then also like maybe this is an important interpretability target.
Yeah. I guess one thing that occurs to me that's nice about your work is just like specifying, like, what do we even mean by search? What do we mean by like internal look ahead? Like, I don't know. There are sort of different algorithms that networks could be doing, and you could imagine like different things you might call search or whatever having different safety concerns, and just like mapping out the space of like quasi reasoning like things that models could have going on. It seems like it could potentially be important.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and I don't think we do a lot of that in this work. Like we're basically saying, okay, we take this one particular rough definition of what we mean by look ahead, which is mainly motivated by, well, that's what we can show the model is actually doing,
right.
Rather than by carefully thinking through the threat models here. And I think one of the reasons why maybe I'm not sure how important all of this or like this project is for X-Risk is that the specific kinds of things we find I think are sort of unusually clean, because we're looking at this chess playing model where the domain is very simple and we can find relatively explicit signs of look-ahead algorithms at least. And then I kind of suspect that if you want to think about like, oh, is my language model internally planning, this just looks pretty different potentially. But I mean, this could be a first step. And I think if someone could, do similar things, but for language models somehow, that seems much harder, but also probably closer to what we care about.
Yeah. So do you think I guess you worked on this paper and you have a bunch of co-authors. I'm wondering like how much follow-up work should I expect to see in the next year or two? So none of my co-authors or like I don't have any concrete plans for follow-up work, but I've talked to several people who like there's been a little bit of follow-up work already by some independent people who just happened to see the paper and did some small experiments on that same model. And I know of people who are interested in like doing this in more interesting settings. So I would guess we'll see at least some sort of smaller projects on chess models, and I would be excited to also see something on language models, but I'm much less sure what that should look like. Sure. So if listeners are interested in like maybe doing some follow-up work, it sounds like you think trying to find something similar in language models and seeing if the mechanism is similar or different. It sounded like that was one thing you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Are there other types of follow-up that you would be excited to see?
So I guess the other direction for follow-up would mainly be just trying to understand better what happens in Lila or in some other similar model. Like I would say our understanding is still very, like we have a lot of evidence, I think, that there's something interesting going on, but we don't really understand the algorithms well. And I think it would be an interesting target for just doing typical mechanistic interpretability, or you try to figure out how does it actually work. And my sense is that you could probably make pretty significant progress just by looking at this specific model or similar models. And I guess if people are interested, they can read our paper, and also if they want to work on this, reach out to me and ask about specific ideas I have, or just talk to me about things.
I wonder if it's almost similar to so there are these there's this like Othello GPT paper where people are trying to figure out if Othello has this or if models. Is this a transformer trained to play Othello or just trained to?
So Othello GPT, it plays Othello, but not well. Like it mainly makes legal moves, and the main point there is that the model. So that model is trained on sequences of moves, and then the main point is that it learns to internally represent the board state. And in our case, the model already gets the board state as input, and then the main point is that it's like using that to play well somehow.
Yeah.
I do think it could be interesting to combine those. Like, I mean, people have also trained models to play chess analogously to Othello GPT and have shown similar things there where they sort of represent the board state. So you could see if those models also learn to use that latent representation of a board state to do planning. I think it's probably more challenging than what we did, definitely, but would be an interesting extension.
Right.
So I think, those models
would have to really rely on the probe.
I think from an interpretability perspective, the challenge is that now your probe is already like some imperfect representation of the board state.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that would be an interesting challenge. I think that the other question is, are those models actually planning or not? Like for the model we looked at, it's there are lots of estimates for how good it is exactly. It's probably not quite human grandmaster level, but it's like very strong at chess. And so that was like the main reason going in why I was optimistic that it was doing something interesting. Those models trained on sequences of moves, they sort of have a much harder job, obviously. They don't get to see the current board state.
Right.
And so they tend to be quite a bit weaker right now. And so I'm less confident that they're actually doing something as nice and interesting. And that makes it probably harder to understand how they work. But it would be interesting to look into.
Yeah, that actually reminds me. So one thing you mentioned in the paper, maybe it's in a footnote, maybe not, is like, you say, we don't necessarily claim that this network is doing planning in every case. We just try and find a subset of cases where it is. So I guess you've mentioned that there are like certain chess problems where you don't notice this look ahead thing.
Yeah.
And you're looking at chess problems, not things broadly. In cases where you are not finding look ahead behavior with your methods, do you think the network is not actually doing look ahead search, or do you think like you're just failing to find it?
Yeah, that's a very good question and hard to know. My guess is probably that look ahead is always going on to some extent, just because I feel like probably neural networks have a hard time completely like switching off certain types of circuits contextually, but maybe they can if they. I don't know. But my best guess would be there's always some of that going on. It's just not always as influential for the output. Like sometimes you just have heuristics that already solve the task, and then the look ahead just isn't really necessary. And if you ablate it, the network still gets the answer right.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks very much for chatting with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.
This episode was edited by Kate Brunotz, and Amber Dornace helped with transcription. The opening and closing themes are by Jack Garrett. Financial support for this episode was provided by the Long-Term Future Fund, along with patrons such as Alexei Malafeyev. To read a transcript of the episode, or to learn how to support the podcast yourself, you can visit axrp.net. Finally, if you have any feedback about this podcast, you can email me at feedback@axrp.net.